Hey everyone, I just pulled some cards for Cancer, and what came through is honestly so revealing about the psychological journey you're going through right now. I'm seeing patterns here that feel really significant, especially around how you process emotions and relate to yourself during this particular phase of your life. Let me share what the cards are showing me because there's some really important insight here that I think you need to hear. So I shuffled the deck asking specifically what psychological lesson Cancer is learning right now. And the first card that came out is the Ten of Wands. This card immediately caught my attention because it's such a powerful representation of how you carry emotional weight. When I see this card in a psychological reading, it's telling me that part of what you're learning right now is about recognizing the burden you place on yourself. You know how Cancer is naturally the caretaker of the zodiac, right? You're always the one people come to with their problems. You're the emotional support system for so many people in your life, and honestly, you probably don't even realize how much weight you're carrying on a daily basis. But here's what this card is really teaching you on a psychological level. It's not just about the external burdens, it's about how you internalize responsibility for other people's emotions. There's this tendency you have to absorb everything around you to make other people's problems your own. And what happens is you end up carrying this massive emotional load that was never really yours to carry in the first place. The lesson here is about learning to distinguish between compassion and codependency. You can care about someone without making their emotional state your responsibility. You can support someone without depleting yourself in the process. What I'm seeing is that you're in a phase where the universe is asking you to examine why you do this. Where does this pattern come from? For a lot of Cancers, it goes back to early experiences where you learned that your value was tied to how much you could give, how much you could nurture, how much you could fix for other people. Maybe you grew up in an environment where you had to be the emotional stabilizer, or maybe you learned that love was conditional on how useful you could be. Whatever the origin, this card is showing me that you're now at a point where you need to unpack that conditioning and start asking yourself some really honest questions about why you carry so much. The psychological work here is deep. It's about understanding that setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish or uncaring. It's about recognizing that you have limits, that your emotional energy is finite and precious, and that preserving it isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. You're learning that saying no is actually an act of self-respect, not a betrayal of your caring nature. This is huge for Cancer, because your identity is so wrapped up in being the person who's always there, always available, always ready to help. But what happens when you're so busy holding everyone else up that you forget to take care of yourself? That's the question this card is asking you to sit with. I want you to think about how this shows up in your daily life. Do you find yourself exhausted at the end of the day even though you didn't do anything particularly strenuous? That's emotional exhaustion from carrying too much. Do you struggle to relax because you're always mentally checking in on everyone else, worrying about them, thinking about what they might need? That's the Ten of Wands energy. You're learning that this pattern isn't sustainable, and more importantly, it's not actually serving anyone, including the people you're trying to help. When you're depleted, you can't show up as your best self for anyone. The second card I pulled is the Eight of Cups, and this one took the reading in such an interesting direction. If the Ten of Wands is about recognizing the burden you carry, the Eight of Cups is about the psychological process of walking away from what no longer serves you. This is fascinating because it's showing me that part of your lesson right now involves letting go of emotional attachments that have defined you for a long time. We're talking about relationships, situations, maybe even aspects of your own identity that you've outgrown but are still clinging to out of fear or habit. For Cancer, walking away from anything is incredibly difficult because you're so emotionally invested in everything you commit to. You don't just dip your toes in, you dive all the way in, and that level of emotional investment makes it really hard to recognize when something has run its course. The Eight of Cups is telling me that you're learning to honor the part of yourself that knows when it's time to move on, even when your heart is telling you to stay and try harder. This is such a profound psychological lesson because it challenges your core belief that loyalty and love mean never giving up on people or situations. What I'm picking up is that there might be relationships in your life right now where you're realizing that the emotional return doesn't match what you're putting in. Maybe it's a friendship that's become one-sided, or a family dynamic that drains you, or even a romantic connection where you're doing all the emotional labor. The Eight of Cups is about that moment of clarity when you realize that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and actually for the other person too, is to step back and create some distance. The psychological work here is about understanding that leaving doesn't mean you failed. This is really important for you to hear because Cancer tends to internalize endings as personal failures. If a relationship doesn't work out, you immediately go to self-blame, thinking about what you could have done differently, how you could have tried harder, what you did wrong. But this card is teaching you that sometimes things end not because you didn't do enough, but because they've simply served their purpose in your life. Not everything is meant to last forever, and recognizing that takes real wisdom and emotional maturity. I'm also seeing that this card relates to how you process disappointment. When you invest so much emotionally and things don't work out the way you hoped, it can feel devastating. You're learning that disappointment is part of the human experience, and that walking away from situations that disappoint you repeatedly isn't giving up, it's self-preservation. You're allowed to acknowledge that something isn't working for you anymore. You're allowed to choose your own well-being over maintaining something that's causing you pain. The third card that came out is Justice, and this completely shifts the energy of the reading into something even more profound. Justice in a psychological context is all about balance, fairness, and most importantly, truth. What this card is revealing is that you're in a phase of learning to see situations and relationships with clear eyes, without the emotional distortion that sometimes clouds your judgment. Cancer, you have this beautiful gift of empathy, but sometimes that empathy can make it hard for you to see people as they actually are, rather than as you hope they could be. Justice is teaching you about emotional honesty. It's asking you to look at your relationships and your own patterns with brutal honesty and to stop making excuses for behavior that hurts you. This might sound harsh, but it's actually incredibly liberating. How much energy do you spend rationalizing why people treat you a certain way? How often do you give people the benefit of the doubt to your own detriment? Justice is saying that you're learning to call things what they are, to stop sugarcoating reality, and to hold both yourself and others accountable. There's also something here about karmic balance and understanding cause and effect in your emotional life. You're learning that the energy you put out comes back to you, and if you're constantly pouring into people who don't reciprocate, that creates an imbalance that eventually has to be addressed. Justice is about restoring equilibrium, and sometimes that means having difficult conversations, setting firm boundaries, or making choices that prioritize your own needs for once. What I find really interesting is how this card relates to self-judgment. Cancer, you can be incredibly hard on yourself, constantly analyzing your own behavior, questioning your reactions, wondering if you're doing enough or being enough. Justice is teaching you to apply the same compassion to yourself that you so freely give to others. If a friend came to you with the same situation you're facing, what would you tell them? Would you judge them as harshly as you judge yourself? Probably not. You're learning to be fair with yourself, to recognize your own worth, and to treat yourself with the same kindness you extend to everyone else. The fourth card is the Six of Wands, and this is where the reading starts to show you the breakthrough that comes from doing this psychological work. The Six of Wands is about recognition, achievement, and stepping into your power. What this is telling me is that as you do the work of releasing burdens, walking away from what doesn't serve you, and seeing things clearly, you're going to experience a real shift in how you see yourself and how others see you too. This card suggests that you're learning to own your value without needing constant external validation. That's huge for Cancer because you tend to seek reassurance from others, looking for signs that you're loved, that you're appreciated, that you matter. The Six of Wands is showing me that you're developing an internal sense of worth that doesn't depend on other people's approval or recognition. You're learning to validate yourself, to acknowledge your own achievements, and to celebrate your growth without waiting for someone else to notice it first. There's also something here about leadership and influence. As you step into this more balanced, boundaried version of yourself, people are going to respond to that energy. You might find that you naturally attract more respect, that people take you more seriously, that your opinions carry more weight. This isn't because you've changed who you are fundamentally. It's because you're no longer diminishing yourself to make others comfortable. You're standing in your truth, and that authenticity is magnetic. The psychological lesson here is about confidence and self-trust. You're learning that you don't need to shrink yourself or apologize for your needs. You're learning that taking up space is okay, that asking for what you want is okay, that prioritizing yourself is okay. For someone who's spent so much time putting everyone else first, this can feel uncomfortable at first, maybe even selfish. But the Six of Wands is confirming that this is exactly the shift you need to make. The fifth card I pulled is the Ace of Cups, and this one really touched me because it's showing me that, Underneath all of this psychological work is a journey back to emotional authenticity and openness. After all the releasing and boundary setting and truth-telling, the Ace of Cups represents a new beginning in how you experience and express emotions. It's like you're being offered a fresh start emotionally, a chance to approach your feelings with more clarity and less fear. What I'm seeing is that you're learning to feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Cancer, you feel everything so deeply, and sometimes that intensity can be scary. You might have learned to suppress certain feelings or to distract yourself from emotions that feel too big to handle. The Ace of Cups is teaching you that your emotional depth is actually your superpower, not something to be afraid of or ashamed of. You're learning to sit with your feelings, to process them fully, and to let them move through you without getting stuck. This card also speaks to self-love and the capacity to fill your own cup. So much of your energy goes outward, loving and nurturing others, but the Ace of Cups is asking you to turn that love inward. What does it look like to nurture yourself with the same tenderness you show others? What does it look like to prioritize your own emotional needs? You're learning that self-love isn't narcissistic or selfish. It's the foundation for everything else. When your own cup is full, you can give from the overflow rather than from a place of depletion. There's also a beautiful energy here of emotional renewal and hope. If you've been through some difficult emotional experiences recently, the Ace of Cups is showing me that you're entering a phase of healing and opening up again. You're learning that just because you've been hurt doesn't mean you have to close your heart permanently. You're discovering that it's possible to be both emotionally open and boundaried, vulnerable and protected at the same time. The sixth card is the Moon, and this card always brings such intense energy to a reading. The Moon is all about the subconscious, intuition, and the parts of yourself that you might not fully understand or acknowledge. In the context of psychological lessons, this card is revealing that you're in a phase of deep inner exploration, confronting fears and illusions that have been operating under the surface of your conscious awareness. What I'm picking up is that you're learning to trust your intuition even when it doesn't make logical sense. Cancer, you have incredibly strong intuitive abilities, but sometimes you second-guess yourself or talk yourself out of what you're sensing because it doesn't align with what you want to believe or what seems rational. The Moon is teaching you that your gut feelings are valid, that your intuition is picking up on things that your conscious mind hasn't processed yet, and that learning to honor those instincts is crucial for your psychological well-being. This card also points to anxiety and the way your mind can create fears that aren't based in reality. You might find yourself worrying about things that haven't happened, imagining worst-case scenarios, or feeling anxious without a clear reason why. The Moon is showing me that you're learning to distinguish between intuitive warnings and anxiety-driven thoughts. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes your mind is just processing emotions or working through fears, and learning to recognize that difference is part of your psychological growth right now. There's also something here about illusions and self-deception. The Moon asks you to look at the stories you tell yourself about your life, your relationships, and yourself. Are these stories based in truth, or are they narratives you've created to make sense of things or to avoid uncomfortable realities? You're learning to be honest with yourself about what's really going on, to stop romanticizing situations that are actually problematic, and to see people and circumstances as they truly are rather than as you wish they were. The seventh card is the Devil. And I know this card can seem scary, but in psychological readings, it's actually incredibly valuable. The Devil represents attachments, patterns, and behaviors that keep you stuck. It's about recognizing the ways you might be your own worst enemy, the self-sabotaging patterns you engage in, the unhealthy attachments you maintain even though they're harmful. For Cancer, the Devil often shows up around emotional dependency and the fear of being alone. You might find yourself staying in situations that aren't good for you because the thought of being alone feels worse than staying in something unhealthy. You're learning that this fear of aloneness is actually keeping you trapped in cycles that prevent your growth. The psychological lesson here is about understanding that being alone is not the same as being lonely, and that sometimes you need solitude to reconnect with yourself and break free from patterns of codependency. This card is also about addictive patterns. And I don't just mean substances, I mean emotional addictions. Are you addicted to drama? To fixing people? To relationships that keep you in a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance? The Devil is showing me that you're becoming aware of these patterns and starting to question why you're drawn to them. What need are they meeting? What are you avoiding by staying in these cycles? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're essential for your growth. There's also something here about power and control. The devil can represent situations where you feel powerless, where you've given your power away to people or circumstances. You're learning to reclaim that power, to recognize that you always have choices even when it doesn't feel like it. You're not as stuck as you think you are. The chains in the devil card are loose enough to slip off if you choose to. You're learning that a lot of what keeps you bound is actually your own fear of what life would look like without these familiar patterns. The 8th card is Queen of Wands, and this is such a powerful contrast to some of the heavier cards we've seen. The Queen of Wands is confident, charismatic, passionate, and completely comfortable in her own skin. In the context of your psychological lesson, this card is showing me the version of yourself you're growing into as you do this inner work. You're learning to embody confidence, to trust yourself, and to move through the world with more boldness and self-assurance. What strikes me about this card appearing in your reading is that it represents qualities that might not come naturally to Cancer. You're so used to being gentle, nurturing, and accommodating that the idea of being bold and assertive might feel foreign or even uncomfortable. But the Queen of Wands is teaching you that you can be both nurturing and strong, both compassionate and boundaried. These qualities aren't mutually exclusive. You're learning to integrate different aspects of yourself into a more complete, authentic version of who you are. This card also speaks to creativity and passion, and I'm seeing that part of your psychological journey involves reconnecting with what genuinely excites you and lights you up. When you spend so much time focused on other people's needs and emotions, it's easy to lose touch with your own desires and interests. The Queen of Wands is asking you to explore what you're passionate about, what makes you feel alive, what you would pursue if you weren't worried about other people's opinions or needs. You're learning that nurturing your own passions and interests isn't selfish. It's essential for your well-being and fulfillment. There's also an energy here of magnetism and attracting what you want rather than chasing it. As you develop more confidence and self-assurance, you're going to find that opportunities and relationships come to you more easily. You won't have to work so hard to convince people of your worth or to earn their love and respect. You're learning to embody your values so fully that it becomes obvious to everyone around you. The 9th card is 2 of Wands, and this card is all about vision, planning, and making decisions about your future. In terms of psychological lessons, this card is showing me that you're at a crossroads where you need to make some important choices about the direction of your life. You're learning to think bigger, to expand your vision of what's possible for yourself, and to make decisions based on what you truly want, rather than what feels safe or familiar. What I'm seeing is that you're in a phase of contemplation and assessment. You're looking at your life and asking yourself some big questions. Is this where I want to be? Are these the relationships I want to invest in? Am I living in alignment with my values and desires? The 2 of Wands represents that moment of standing at the threshold, knowing that you need to make a choice but maybe feeling uncertain about which direction to go. The psychological work here is about developing clarity and trusting yourself to make good decisions. Cancer, you can sometimes struggle with decision-making because you're so aware of how your choices might affect other people. You might stay in situations longer than you should because you don't want to hurt anyone or disappoint anyone. The 2 of Wands is teaching you that you need to prioritize your own path and your own growth, even if that means making choices that other people might not understand or agree with. This card also speaks to courage and the willingness to step into the unknown. You're learning that growth requires risk, that you can't expand your life while staying completely within your comfort zone. You're being called to take some chances, to pursue opportunities that excite you even if they feel scary, to trust that you have the resources and resilience to handle whatever comes. This is about building confidence in your ability to navigate uncertainty and to create the life you actually want, rather than settling for what feels safe. The 10th and final card is 10 of Pentacles, and this brings such a beautiful grounding energy to close out the reading. The 10 of Pentacles is about legacy, stability, long-term security, and the feeling of having built something meaningful and lasting. In the context of your psychological journey, this card is showing me the outcome of all this inner work you're doing. You're building a foundation for lasting emotional security and well-being. What this card is revealing is that all of these lessons about boundaries, self-worth, releasing what doesn't serve you, and trusting yourself are leading you toward a place of genuine stability and peace. You're learning to create emotional security from within, rather than depending on external circumstances or other people to make you feel safe and valued. This is profound work because it means you're no longer at the mercy of other people's behavior or approval. Your sense of well-being isn't dependent on anyone else, And that's true freedom. The Ten of Pentacles also speaks to family and community, but in a healthier, more balanced way than you might have experienced before. You're learning what healthy family dynamics look like, what it means to be part of a community without losing yourself, how to contribute to something larger than yourself while still maintaining your own identity and boundaries. You're discovering that you can be connected and independent at the same time. That intimacy doesn't require losing yourself in the other person. There's also an energy here of abundance and prosperity, not just material but emotional and spiritual as well. As you do this psychological work and heal these patterns, you're going to find that life flows more easily. Opportunities appear, relationships improve, you feel more fulfilled and satisfied. This isn't magic, it's the natural result of living in alignment with your truth and treating yourself with the respect and care you deserve. What really strikes me about this card, appearing as the final card, is that it represents completion and fulfillment. All of this challenging psychological work you're doing has a purpose and a payoff. You're not just processing pain for the sake of it, you're actively building a better, more authentic life for yourself. You're creating a legacy of emotional health and self-awareness that will benefit not just you, but everyone around you, especially if you have or plan to have children. You're breaking cycles and establishing new, healthier patterns that can be passed down. So Cancer, to wrap all of this up, the psychological lesson you're learning right now is multifaceted and profound. You're learning to release the burden of carrying everyone else's emotions, to walk away from what no longer serves you, to see situations with clarity and honesty, to own your value and achievements, to nurture yourself with the same care you give others, to trust your intuition, to recognize and break free from unhealthy patterns, to embody confidence and passion, to make bold decisions about your future, and to build lasting emotional security from within. This is deep, transformative work, and it's not always comfortable. There will be moments where you question whether you're doing the right thing, where you feel guilty for prioritizing yourself, where you're tempted to fall back into old patterns because they're familiar. But I want you to know that you're exactly where you need to be, learning exactly what you need to learn at this point in your life. Trust the process, be patient with yourself, and know that every step you take toward greater self-awareness and self-respect is building the foundation for a more fulfilling, authentic life. I hope this reading resonated with you and gave you some clarity about what you're going through right now. If any of this hit home for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Take care of yourself, Cancer. You're doing better than you think you are.